Hey everyone, in the past few videos we talked about the things you need to get your application started. Things like hosting, database, authentication, file storage. In this video and the next few, we're going to talk about things that you don't necessarily need to get up and running, but you should have. And we're going to start with logging. So let's go. All right, so with logging, it's going to be pretty simple. We're going to talk about the pros, the cons, and some of the different implementations you can have. So let's get started with the pros. So first, we want to talk about why you would want to have logging, right? So what are the pros of implementing it? Because do keep in mind, and we'll cover this in the cons, adding logging takes effort, right? Like you need to write the code to add the logs, organize them, and so on. So what are the benefits that you get from having logging? First of all, especially in distributed systems, things like microservices or maybe you're hosting multiple apps, you need logging so you can debug your application. You can't always hook up a debugger in Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code or whatever other IDE you're using. Sometimes you're hosting in production and an exception occurs and you need that logged somewhere so you can debug, you can triage it first and then debug it and troubleshoot it. So you need logging just to see when bad things happen in your application, right? So debugging and troubleshooting is really I would say like the primary way to use logging. That's the first thing that developers do when they add logging. But there are also other things that you may want to implement logging for. These four here are probably a little bit less important, but may still provide value. So real-time alerts, these are things like when something occurs that you really want to know about right now, right this minute, maybe you want to get paged. Just kidding. You will want to have logs, and logs don't necessarily need to be writing to a data store. Most do, but you can write logs to a data store, for example, like a database, and you can have a trigger that says, hey, if a record of this type was inserted, please send an SMS, something like that, right? You could hook that up. So real-time alerts based on log entries, also possible. Obviously, it should be used sparingly. You don't want to get pinged all the time when things are happening, but that is something you can do. Audit trail, which is it's also really quite I would say it's not necessary, but it is nice to see when people are doing things, right? So someone modifies some entity in your database and you want to know who did that. Well, if you're logging who does what and when, you can just look at the logs and be like, oh, this guy, he's the one that deleted that customer from our database or whatever, something like that. So audit trail, also not necessary, but I would have it, especially if you have very important information and like no restore points or whatever. Audit trail, very important. Performance analysis, now we're getting into the less important things. So performance analysis is basically, hey, you want to know how fast things are running in your application. So when someone makes a request that comes into your application, you log the entry of that request, the timestamp, and then you do your processing on your server, and then you send a response and you log again when the response is being sent. And then you have, this is like super rudimentary, right? But this is kind of what you could use logging for. And then analytics is essentially a way for you to see how people are using your application. So you may already be familiar with Google Analytics. This is something you hook up to your website. It's super popular. There are alternatives, of course, which I will go over shortly. But analytics kind of tells you what happens when a customer is using your application. So they click on this, then they go to that screen, they fill in these fields, they press that button, and so on. So you can get that kind of information. I would say like analytics is also pretty important, especially if as your application grows and has a lot of different flows that customers can go through, not just like the sign up flow or whatever. Analytics also good for things like figuring out the bounce rate of certain features within your application, or even like your website, right? Like people come and spend 30 seconds and then leave. It's not a good sign. So you can use logging for analytics for that. So those are the pros. These are why you would want to implement logging. Now let's take a look at the cons. So as I mentioned previously, you got to write the code, right? So logging doesn't just automatically happen. You need to implement it throughout your application. And as you do, you're implementing lines of code that say, hey, do something when this occurs, right? That essentially means, and then you're sending that information somewhere, right, to some kind of storage, because you want to look at it later. Maybe you want to run some AI on it or something, some analytics. Well, you're writing every single time something happens, a button is pressed, page is navigated, or an error occurs. There's always writing, right? So IO overhead, input output, right? So you're basically writing to somewhere. It doesn't have to be the disk, right? It could be like a third-party provider. Nevertheless, you're still writing. So there's always that overhead that you got to account for in your application. It's minimal, but it's there. Storage cost, well, obviously, since you're writing, so storage costs kind of not a big deal initially as you're first building your application, especially if your application is small. Maybe this isn't even a concern. But as your application grows and you start logging more things, for example, you do add an audit trail, maybe you do have analytics, and of course debugging and troubleshooting. Suddenly, especially depending on how verbose your logs are, you may start taking up a lot of space, and you have to pay for that space somewhere, whether it's a cloud provider or a logging provider, or maybe just on disk. You need storage, and you have to pay for that. So that's something to also keep in mind. So your performance may suffer a little bit of your application, very, very tiny amount, and you're gonna have to pay for storing all those logs. Then as you're logging, you have to also think about things like, am I logging the correct information, right? Am I sanitizing the logs? For example, obviously you don't want to log any PII, personally identifiable information, or passwords, God forbid you do that, or anything else that doesn't want to be stored in plain text, right? Things that want to be encrypted. You don't want to be logging those at all. Possibly things even like an email, someone's email, right? Like it's just not good. It's not good to have that stored in plain text. So you gotta as you're adding the logs, you gotta sanitize the data. Then once you have a lot of logs, you have to organize them. Otherwise, you're gonna just have like a dump of logs. You're gonna have no idea what you're looking for. So platforms like PostHog, and we'll talk about these in a moment, will have a way for you to organize your logs. So you kind of categorize them, put them into different categories, like folders and stuff like that. And it kind of gives you a semblance of organization, makes it easier for you to look at the logs. Especially you want to have, for example, your exceptions separated from your audit trail, separated from your analytics, as an example. And management. So you don't want to be storing logs forever. So for example, exceptions. You want to store exceptions maybe for a month, maybe a couple weeks, depending on your budget, obviously. And depending on how active you are with exceptions, you want to delete them after some time, so you're paying less for storage, right? You don't want to keep them forever. So you have to think about those kinds of strategies for log management and organization. So there's quite a bit that you gotta kind of think through prior to implementing logging. And lastly, I put too much logging is bad. This is true regardless of whether you organize, everything is so neat and categorized. If you're logging too much, especially your logs are too verbose, it takes too long to look through those logs. Now, nowadays, you can add things like AI. It's AI is everywhere nowadays, right? So you can add things like AI and it'll be like, oh, we noticed that you're logging a lot of exceptions coming from this controller. So maybe you want to take a look at, like, it's kind of useful because it makes it so you don't have to like visually parse through the logs to see what's happening. You get like a summary view of what your exceptions are from AI, which is kind of handy. And especially some AIs can connect to other third-party services like Stack Overflow and be like, oh, this exception, we know about that one. It comes from blah, blah, blah. And it can give you, it can hook up and give you like a potential solution to that exception. So kind of very handy. But too much logging can still be bad because, first of all, performance suffers. You're paying for it. It potentially disorganized. There's just a ton of it. And if you're paying for AI features, tokens, there's a max amount of tokens. So, and everything costs money. So you just have to think about the cost, really, honestly. So too much logging is bad. So those are the cons. So we went over the pros, the cons. Now let's talk about some providers. Let's focus on the cloud infrastructure providers. So they're the three cloud providers, right? Google, Amazon, and Microsoft all have their cloud. And let's start with Google. So Google they all basically have the same monitoring capabilities, right? They're just called different things. Google has the Google Cloud Logging, Cloud Trace, and Monitor, which combines, I think, Trace and Analytics or Diagnostics or something like that. Azure has App Insights, and then Monitor, which combines App Insights with something else. I forgot exactly what. But AWS, of course, has CloudWatch and X-Ray. So these are used together. So basically, like you're getting logging out of the box if you implement their SDKs in your applications. And these are good. Like I've actually used App Insights and Google Cloud Logging, and they're good. They're good enough to get started. So if you're hosting on one of these, they're not free, but they're fairly cheap. If you're looking, if you're hosting on one of these cloud providers, I recommend you to use these because they're built in, they integrate really well, and they're easy to use with the SDKs. But let's say you're hosting on a service like, I don't know, Railway or Vercel or Cloudflare or something, and you need logging that's more robust than what they provide. In that case, you can use the third-party provider, like the four you see here: PostHog, Datadog, New Relic, Honeycomb. So PostHog, my personal favorite, but other ones are just fine. You just have to look at the pricing. PostHog has a fairly generous free tier, so something to look into. Also, again, I keep coming back to cost, but there's a cost associated with storing data, and of course the input-output, the traffic. So I urge you to take a look at these four. I'm sure there are more, but third-party providers, you can use PostHog for things like exceptions, audit trail, analytics, so, and the other ones as well. So take a look at these products. These are just four that you can look at. There's some other ones. And third-party providers are for applications which are hosted on platforms that do not have robust logging. And lastly, if you just care about, if you remember back here, we talked about analytics. If you just care about analytics, meaning logging the flows through your application, for example, the sign-up flow or the checkout flow, or the create whatever product flow, or something like that. If you just care about those, you could use one of these 4. And again, there are other ones, but Plausible is very kind of simple. They just do like one thing, which is analytics. Their dashboard is very easy to understand. And there are other ones on this list as well. You'll notice I put Google Analytics at the bottom. That is because, Google uses cookies and the other ones don't. Now, Matomo, I don't remember exactly, but Plausible doesn't. So there's an SDK, you implement that SDK, and there's no cookies required. Google Analytics uses cookies, and often, especially people who have ad blockers, you'll notice it doesn't work because Google Analytics is blocked. Or anybody on a VPN doesn't work because often Google Analytics is blocked. Anybody using the Brave browser doesn't work because Google Analytics. So like, there's a drawback to using Google Analytics. But if you just care about flows, Plausible is good. And check out the other ones as well. So that's kind of it for logs. I want you to just keep in mind, everything boils down to cost here. And I'm not just talking about the money cost. Like we talked about storage costs, right? That's one thing. We're also talking about the time it's going to take your engineers to implement that logging. If you have like some complex logging scheme where you're abstracting like 5 different layers, it's going to take time to implement all that logging. You're taking engineer time away from building features for your customers. Something to keep in mind too, right? Now, that said, you want to have at least this debugging and troubleshooting logging. You don't need these other ones to get your product out the door. You definitely could use analytics, especially because it helps with like improving your product. So, but you really should have exception logging at the minimum. So the ROI, again, the ROI on logging, very high right here for debugging and troubleshooting. Like pretty, like I would say medium for analytics, and small ROI for these ones here. But as your application grows, you're gonna need to start implementing more and more of these. So that's about it for logging. Thanks for watching, and I'll hope to see you in the next one. Take care.